Your brain can die before your body. Let that sentence sit with you for a moment. Not metaphorically, not emotionally, biologically, neurologically, quietly. Your heart can still beat. Your lungs can still pull in air. Your blood can still circulate. And yet, the part of you that thinks, remembers, feels purpose, makes decisions, and recognizes meaning can already be shutting down. Most people imagine death as a single moment, a flat line, a final breath, a dramatic end. But that's not how it really happens. For millions of people, death begins years earlier, inside the brain, while the body keeps going. I'm Dr. Stuart R. Miller. I've spent decades studying cognitive decline, neural degeneration, memory erosion, attention collapse, and the silent processes that dismantle the human mind long before the body gives up. And the most terrifying thing I've learned isn't how fragile the brain is. Your brain can die before your body. And most people never realize it's happening because it doesn't announce itself with pain or alarms or a dramatic collapse. It happens quietly, subtly, in moments you dismiss as normal aging, stress, or tiredness. But what's really happening is far more serious because while your heart may still beat strongly and your lungs may still fill with air, the organ that makes you who you are can already be slipping away, neuron by neuron, connection by connection, memory by memory. And I'm Dr. Stuart R. Miller, and I've spent my career studying cognitive decline, watching brilliant minds slowly dim while their bodies continued to function. And the most frightening truth I've learned is that brain death is rarely sudden. It's progressive, invisible, and often mistaken for personality change, burnout, or just getting older, when in reality it's a biological process unfolding beneath the surface. Because the brain is not like other organs. It doesn't scream when it's injured. It whispers. And those whispers show up as forgotten names, reduced curiosity, slower reactions, emotional numbness, poor judgment, loss of motivation, and a shrinking inner world. And most people don't panic when this begins because society has normalized mental decline. We joke about brain fog, we laugh about forgetfulness, we accept distraction as normal, and we wear exhaustion like a badge of honor. But biologically, your brain interprets this lifestyle as threat because your brain evolved to survive scarcity, movement, challenge, and focus, not constant stimulation, chronic stress, sleep deprivation, sugar overload, and digital saturation. And when those conditions persist, your brain adapts by conserving energy, shutting down non-essential circuits, pruning connections that aren't being used, and rerouting blood flow away from higher cognitive regions. And this is where the real danger begins, because the first parts of the brain to suffer aren't the ones that keep you alive, they're the ones that make life meaningful. Your prefrontal cortex, responsible for decision-making, impulse control, long-term planning, and self-awareness, begins to lose efficiency, which is why people become more reactive, more impulsive, more emotionally volatile, and less capable of deep thinking long before they ever receive a diagnosis. And meanwhile, the hippocampus, the structure that forms and retrieves memories, is highly sensitive to stress hormones like cortisol, and chronic stress literally shrinks it, not metaphorically, physically, reducing your ability to learn, remember, and contextualize your experiences. And this is why people start living in mental loops, repeating the same mistakes, stuck in the same thought patterns, unable to imagine a different future, and they assume it's a character flaw, laziness, or lack of discipline, when in reality their brain is operating with reduced capacity. And here's the part no one warns you about. Your brain doesn't need to be completely dead to be effectively gone, because cognitive death exists on a spectrum, and many people are walking around with brains that are alive at a cellular level, but functionally compromised, meaning the lights are on, but the processing power is gone, and this happens through a combination of inflammation, insulin resistance in the brain, reduced cerebral blood flow, mitochondrial dysfunction, and synaptic loss, all driven by modern habits that feel harmless in the moment, like sitting all day, sleeping poorly, consuming ultra-processed food, living in constant alert mode, and never allowing the brain to fully rest or fully focus. And over time, these conditions create a brain environment that favors survival over creativity, efficiency over curiosity, and routine over growth. And the brain begins to narrow its operating range, limiting emotional depth, reducing empathy, flattening joy, and prioritizing short-term comfort over long-term meaning. And this is why people describe feeling mentally older than they are, disconnected from themselves, unable to feel excitement, stuck in autopilot, because the brain is slowly retreating into a low-energy state. And the tragedy is that the body can continue functioning for decades in this condition because the brain will sacrifice higher functions to preserve basic survival. So you can breathe, eat, work, and reproduce while slowly losing insight, adaptability, and self-awareness. And this is why some people age rapidly in their mind while others remain sharp and curious into old age. It's not luck. It's neurobiology shaped by daily choices, because the brain is plastic, meaning it constantly reshapes itself based on how you use it, what you expose it to, and how you recover. And neglect doesn't look dramatic. It looks like routine, like scrolling endlessly, avoiding discomfort, numbing stress with sugar, caffeine, or entertainment, and telling yourself you'll take care of your health later. But the brain doesn't wait. It adapts now. And once certain neural networks weaken beyond a threshold, rebuilding them becomes exponentially harder. And that's why early cognitive decline often feels irreversible, because by the time symptoms are obvious, years of damage have already accumulated. And this is where the phrase, "your brain can die before your body," becomes literal. Because neurological death is not defined by a single event. It's defined by loss of function, loss of complexity, and loss of adaptability. And the scary part is that many people reach middle age with brains that resemble much older individuals neurologically, not because of genetics, but because of lifestyle-induced degeneration. And yet the most important thing you need to understand is this: the brain is also one of the most resilient organs in the human body. If given the right signals, environment, and challenges, it can rebuild connections, restore function, and regain clarity even after years of neglect. But that requires awareness, because you cannot reverse a process you don't recognize. And that's why this conversation matters, because once you understand that mental decline is not inevitable but conditional, you stop accepting fog, fatigue, and emotional flatness as normal, and you begin treating your brain as the fragile, powerful, adaptive system that it is. Because the goal isn't just to keep your body alive, it's to keep your mind awake, engaged, and fully present for as long as possible. And the real question isn't whether your brain can die before your body. It's whether you're willing to notice the early signs and change the trajectory before that silent death becomes permanent. Your brain can die before your body. Let that sentence sit with you for a moment. Not metaphorically, not emotionally, biologically, neurologically, quietly. Your heart can still beat. Your lungs can still pull in air. Your blood can still circulate. And yet, the part of you that thinks, remembers, feels purpose, makes decisions, and recognizes meaning can already be shutting down. Most people imagine death as a single moment, a flat line, a final breath, a dramatic end. But that's not how it really happens. For millions of people, death begins years earlier, inside the brain, while the body keeps going. I'm Dr. Stuart R. Miller. I've spent decades studying cognitive decline, neural degeneration, memory erosion, attention collapse, and the silent processes that dismantle the human mind long before the body gives up. And the most terrifying thing I've learned isn't how fragile the brain is. Your brain can die before your body. And what makes this reality so dangerous is not that it happens, but that it happens while you're still functioning well enough to believe nothing is wrong. Because the brain is a master of compensation. It reroutes, it patches, it masks, it lowers expectations instead of raising alarms. And this is why people often don't notice the decline until years have passed, because the brain doesn't collapse all at once. It slowly reduces its range, like a dimmer switch being turned down so gradually you forget how bright the room once was. And during this process, your personality doesn't disappear overnight. It erodes. Your sharpness dulls, your curiosity fades, your tolerance for complexity shrinks, and your emotional responses flatten, and you assume this is just what adulthood feels like. But biologically, it's the brain entering a conservation state because chronic stress, poor sleep, nutrient deficiencies, and lack of meaningful challenge signal to the brain that the environment is unsafe or unstable, and when the brain perceives threat, it prioritizes survival circuitry over growth circuitry, which means higher order thinking becomes optional, creativity becomes expendable, long-term planning feels exhausting, and novelty feels threatening rather than exciting. And this is why people start avoiding deep conversations, complex problems, and uncomfortable truths, not because they're weak, but because their neural energy budget has been cut. And one of the earliest casualties in this process is attention, because sustained focus is metabolically expensive, and when the brain is inflamed or underfueled, it fragments attention into short bursts, making it harder to read, think, or listen deeply. Which is why modern distraction isn't just a habit, it's a symptom. And every time you bounce from stimulus to stimulus, your brain reinforces shallow processing, weakening the neural networks responsible for depth, patience, and reflection. And over time, this changes how reality feels, because when attention shrinks, meaning shrinks with it, and life begins to feel hollow, rushed, and unsatisfying. And people try to fix that feeling with more stimulation, more noise, more content, more consumption, not realizing they're feeding the very process that's numbing their brain. And meanwhile, chronic inflammation quietly damages the blood-brain barrier, allowing toxins and immune cells to enter brain tissue, disrupting communication between neurons. And this is where brain fog becomes more than a phrase. It becomes a physiological state, where signals slow, reaction times increase, memory retrieval weakens, and emotional regulation becomes unstable. And the person experiencing this often blames themselves, thinking they're lazy, unmotivated, or broken, when in reality, their brain chemistry has shifted into a less efficient mode, and insulin resistance in the brain plays a massive role here. Because glucose is the brain's primary fuel, and when brain cells become less responsive to insulin, they struggle to absorb energy, creating a state of neural starvation even in the presence of abundant calories. And this is why some researchers refer to Alzheimer's as type 3 diabetes, because long before memory loss becomes obvious, the brain has been energetically compromised, and that compromise affects mood, motivation, and decision-making years before cognition collapses. And add to this the effect of sleep deprivation, which is one of the most underestimated drivers of neural death, because sleep is when the brain clears metabolic waste through the glymphatic system, literally washing away toxins that accumulate during waking hours. And when sleep is shortened or fragmented, those toxins remain, increasing oxidative stress and inflammation, accelerating neuronal damage. And the scariest part is that the brain adapts to poor sleep by lowering performance expectations. So you feel functional, but never fully clear. And this becomes your new baseline without you realizing how much you've lost. And social isolation further compounds this decline, because the human brain evolved in connection, and meaningful social interaction stimulates multiple cognitive domains simultaneously: language, empathy, memory, emotional regulation. And when those interactions are replaced with passive digital consumption, the brain receives far less stimulation per unit of time, leading to underuse and atrophy of complex neural networks. And this is why loneliness is now recognized as a major risk factor for cognitive decline, comparable to smoking or obesity. And yet it often goes untreated because it doesn't look like a medical problem. And then there's the role of movement, because the brain is not separate from the body. Physical activity increases cerebral blood flow, stimulates neurogenesis, and releases growth factors like BDNF that protect and strengthen neurons. And when movement is removed from daily life, the brain loses one of its most powerful maintenance signals, accelerating decline in executive function and memory. And all of these factors stack: stress, sleep, nutrition, movement, attention, connection. And they don't just add up, They multiply, creating a downward spiral where the brain becomes less capable of making the very choices that would protect it. And this is why cognitive decline feels self-perpetuating, because as the brain weakens, discipline weakens, foresight weakens, and habits become harder to change, and people misinterpret this as moral failure when it's actually neurological constraint. And over time, this leads to a phenomenon known as cognitive reserve depletion, where the brain loses its buffer against damage, meaning even small stressors produce exaggerated effects. And this is when people feel overwhelmed by things that once felt manageable, emotionally reactive to minor triggers, and mentally exhausted by simple decisions. And at this stage, the brain is still alive, but it's operating on emergency power, sacrificing depth for efficiency, nuance for simplicity, and adaptability for routine. And this is the point at which many people become rigid in their thinking, resistant to new ideas, and emotionally closed off, not because they choose to be, but because their neural flexibility has been reduced. And this rigidity is often mistaken for personality or values, when in reality it's a sign of declining prefrontal regulation. And yet even here, the process is not necessarily irreversible, because neuroplasticity does not disappear. It becomes harder to access, requiring stronger signals, more consistency, and more patience. And this is why early intervention matters so much, because the longer the brain operates in a low-energy, high-stress state, the more entrenched those pathways become, and the more difficult it is to restore higher function. And this brings us back to the core truth. Your brain can die before your body, not because death arrives early, but because neglect accumulates quietly. And the body will tolerate a compromised brain far longer than the brain will tolerate a compromised environment. And the question is not whether modern life damages the brain, it's whether you're aware enough to counteract it, because awareness changes behavior, and behavior changes biology, and biology shapes destiny. And once you understand that cognitive decline is not a single disease, but a spectrum of dysfunction driven by daily inputs, you stop waiting for a diagnosis and start paying attention to signals, because forgetting names, losing focus, feeling numb, struggling to plan, and living in constant mental fatigue are not just inconveniences, they are messages, and the brain always sends messages before it shuts systems down. And if you listen early, you can change the outcome, but if you ignore them long enough, the brain will adapt without your permission. And by the time you realize what's been lost, the cost of recovery will be far higher than the cost of prevention. And this is why the most important decision you can make is not about extending lifespan, but about preserving mind span, because a long life without a fully functioning brain is not longevity, it's survival. And the real goal is not to stay alive as long as possible, but to stay mentally alive for as long as your body allows. Your brain can die before your body. Let that sentence sit with you for a moment, not metaphorically, not emotionally, biologically, neurologically, quietly. Your heart can still beat, your lungs can still pull in air, your blood can still circulate, and yet the part of you that thinks, remembers, feels purpose, makes decisions, and recognizes meaning can already be shutting down. Most people imagine death as a single moment, a flat line, a final breath, a dramatic end. But that's not how it really happens. For millions of people, death begins years earlier, inside the brain, while the body keeps going. I'm Dr. Stuart R. Miller. I've spent decades studying cognitive decline, neural degeneration, memory erosion, attention collapse, and the silent processes that dismantle the human mind long before the body gives up. And the most terrifying thing I've learned isn't how fragile the brain is.